They told me it would only be for one night. Just one. That's what Andrew said while standing beside the door, avoiding my eyes. Kylie stood a step behind him, smiling too brightly, like someone rehearsing kindness in a mirror. I remember noticing how carefully she held her purse, both hands clasped around it as if she needed something to hold herself together. "It's temporary, Mom," Andrew added. "Just until the repairs are done." Repairs. That word kept echoing in my head long after they left. The motel room was smaller than I expected. Not dirty exactly, but tired. The kind of place that had given up trying to impress anyone years ago. The air smelled faintly of bleach, and something damp underneath it. The curtains were thin, letting in too much light, and the carpet had that sticky feel that made you keep your shoes on. I stood in the middle of the room for a while after they left, listening. Not to anything in particular. Just listening. You develop that habit after a certain age. You learn to pay attention to silence, because sometimes silence tells you more than words ever do. And this silence felt wrong. I didn't unpack. There didn't seem to be a point. I had only brought a small bag anyway, just enough for a couple of days. A change of clothes, my medication, a brush, and the folder. I always kept that folder with me. Documents, records, everything that proved who I was and what belonged to me. Years ago, someone told me that if you don't hold on to your own paperwork, someone else will hold it for you, and they won't always give it back. I never forgot that. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the television bolted to the dresser. It flickered when I tried to turn it on, then went dark again. I didn't bother trying twice. Instead, I looked toward the window. Their car was already gone.
No hesitation.
No looking back. That's when the feeling started to settle in, not panic, not yet, just something quiet and sharp. Like a question I didn't know how to answer. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, something tugged at me. A detail. A tone. The way Andrew had spoken too quickly. The way Kylie had avoided standing too close to me. The way my wallet had somehow ended up accidentally left in their car. Accidents don't stack like that. Not unless they're planned. By morning, I already knew something wasn't right. I just didn't know how wrong it was. The parking lot was empty. I remember that clearly. I pulled the curtain aside expecting to see their car. Maybe Andrew stepping out with coffee. Maybe Kylie checking her phone while waiting. Something ordinary. But there was nothing. Just a row of faded parking lines and a vending machine humming in the corner. I waited. 10 minutes.
20.
Then I reached for the phone.
Dead. No di al tone.
I checked my cell next. It had been charging overnight, but when I looked at the screen, there was no signal. Not even a weak one. Just nothing. That was the moment my chest tightened. Not fear exactly. Recognition. I turned back to my bag, suddenly aware of something I hadn't checked yet. The folder. It wasn't there. At first, I thought I'd misplaced it. That happens sometimes. You put something down without thinking and forget where. So I searched calmly. The bag, the drawers, the bedside table. Then less calmly. Then not calmly at all. I checked under the mattress, behind the dresser, even the bathroom, though I knew I hadn't taken it in there. Nothing. The folder was gone. Every document, every proof of who I was.
Gone.
I stood there for a long time, breathing slowly, trying to keep my hands steady. 74 years teaches you many things. One of them is this. Panic doesn't solve anything.
So I didn't panic.
I got dressed, and I went to the front desk. The girl behind the counter looked like she had just woken up, though it was already past 9. She was chewing gum, scrolling on her phone, barely glancing up when I approached. "Excuse me," I said. "I need to make a call." She shrugged. "Phone's out. I also need to confirm my reservation. I added. Margaret. She typed something lazily into the computer, then shook her head. No reservation under that name. That's not possible, I said. I checked in yesterday. You walked in, she replied. Paid cash. No ID.
Ist her.
That's not correct. She shrugged again. You're checked out anyway. I'm still in the room.
Not anymore, she said.
It's been reassigned. For a moment, I just stood there, letting her words settle. Checked out. Reassigned. As if I were something temporary. Something already gone. I need to call my son, I said quietly. She pointed vaguely toward the street. Try the diner next door. And that was it. No concern. No questions. Just dismissal. The sunlight outside felt too bright. I stepped onto the pavement like someone stepping into a different world. One where nothing quite lined up with what it should be. I had lived 74 years. I had paid every bill on time, raised a child, kept a home, and now I was standing outside a motel with no identification, no money, and no way to prove who I was. It would have been absurd if it weren't happening to me. The diner smelled like coffee and grease. The kind of place where people come every morning and sit in the same seats, talking about the same things.
Familiar.
Predictable. I asked to use the phone. The waitress didn't hesitate. She just nodded and handed it to me. That small kindness nearly broke me. I dialed Andrew first. It rang, then went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I called again. Same result. Then Kylie. Straight to voicemail. Then the house. Disconnected. I stared at the receiver for a long time before placing it back down. That was the moment I stopped hoping it was a mistake. It took 2 buses and a long walk to reach my street. Chestnut Avenue. I had lived there for decades. I knew every crack in the sidewalk, every tree, every neighbor who peeked through their curtains just a little too often. When I turned the corner, everything looked the same. The roses were still blooming. The hedges still needed trimming. For a brief moment, I felt relief. Until I reached the door. The key didn't work. I tried again.
And again.
Until the metal bent slightly in my hand. That's when I knew. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't confusion. This was deliberate. I didn't cry. Not then. I stood in the garden instead, looking at the house I had lived in for most of my life. And I started thinking, not about what I had lost, but about what I still knew. I knew the bank. I knew the legal offices. I knew how records worked. And most importantly, I knew myself. They thought I would disappear quietly. They were wrong. That night, I didn't go back to the motel. There was no point. Whatever had happened there was already over, and I had no intention of standing in places where I no longer existed on paper. Instead, I followed the only option left to me forward. The city felt different when you had nowhere to return to. Every street became longer, every decision heavier. I walked until my legs began to ache. Then I asked for directions. Then I walked again. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of a women's shelter downtown. It wasn't something I had ever imagined for myself, not in all my years, not even in my worst-case scenarios. But life doesn't ask for your imagination before it rearranges itself. It just does it. The woman at the front desk didn't ask many questions. She looked at me, really looked the way people used to look at each other before everything became rushed and distracted, and then she handed me a cup of tea. "We've got a bed," she said softly. That was enough. I nodded and followed her inside. The room was simple.
Clean. Quiet.
A row of cots, a faint hum of heating, the soft rustle of people trying to exist without being noticed. I lay down, staring at the ceiling, my body stiff from the day, my mind anything but still. That's when the thinking began, Not the emotional kind, not the kind that spirals into regret or disbelief, but the precise kind. The kind that builds plans. By the time the lights dimmed, I already knew what I would do in the morning.
First, the bank.
Then someone who could confirm the forgery. Then the county office.
Step by step. Piece by piece.
If they had taken my identity, I would rebuild it in daylight where it couldn't be hidden. I woke before sunrise. Some habits never leave you. My body still remembered years of responsibility, of waking before everyone else, of carrying the day before it had even begun. I washed up, smoothed my hair, and put on the same clothes from yesterday. They were slightly wrinkled now, but still presentable. Presentation matters. Not for others, but for yourself. If you walk into a room already diminished, people will meet you there.
I wasn't going to give them that.
The bank doors opened at 9. I was there at 8:45. There's something about standing outside a familiar place when everything else in your life has shifted. It's like anchoring yourself to something solid, even if just for a moment. I had been a customer there for decades. I had watched managers come and go, policies change, systems update. But the building itself, the doors, the counters, the quiet hum of transactions, remained constant. I stepped inside the moment they opened. The air smelled the same. Paper, air conditioning, something faintly metallic. I walked straight to the service desk.
No hesitation. Good morning, I said.
My name is Margaret. I need to review my accounts. The young woman behind the counter smiled politely. Too politely. Of course. Do you have identification? No, I said calmly. It was taken. Her smile faltered, just slightly. I'm afraid I can't access. I've had an account here for over 40 years, I interrupted, not raising my voice, just studying it. You have records. You have history. And, if necessary, you have people who know me. That was enough to make her pause. She hesitated, then nodded. Let me get the branch manager. His name was Eric. He walked out a moment later, and I recognized him immediately. Older now, more confident, but still carrying that same careful way of moving, like someone who had learned responsibility early and never quite put it down. When he saw me, something in his expression changed. Not alarm, not confusion, but concern. Mrs. Margaret, he said, are you all right?
No, irraplia.
But I will be. He didn't ask more questions. He simply gestured toward his office. That told me everything I needed to know about him. Inside, he pulled up my account. I watched his face as he read. That's the thing about truth. It shows itself in other people before it reaches you. There was a change, he said slowly. A few days ago, your son submitted a notarized power of attorney. I felt something settle into place inside me. Not shock. Confirmation. When? I asked. 3 days ago. The same day they left me. I didn't sign anything, I said. He turned the screen slightly, then printed the document. When he handed it to me, I didn't need more than a second to know. It wasn't mine. It looked like mine. The shape, the flow, the attempt at imitation. But there are things you can't fake if you've lived with them long enough. My handwriting had habits. Small imperfections. A rhythm. This was too clean. Too deliberate. Like someone copying, not writing. That's not my signature, I said. Eric exhaled slowly. If that's the case, we're looking at fraud. Yes, I replied. We are. He explained the process. Formal complaint. Investigation. Temporary freeze on all accounts. Do it, I said before he finished. It will block all access, he warned. Including your son. That's the point. He nodded and began typing. As he worked, I looked out the window. Cars passed by like nothing had changed. People moved through their day without knowing that somewhere, someone had just tried to erase a life with paperwork. But I was still there. And now, so was the evidence. When he finished, he handed me copies. "You'll need to report this," he said. "And you should speak to an attorney." "I will," I replied. And I meant it, because this wasn't just about money. This was about control. The next stop was someone who understood signatures. Not just legally, but personally. Donna had been a notary for as long as I could remember. She had witnessed some of the most important moments of my life on paper. My will, my property documents, everything that required proof beyond words. If anyone could confirm what I already knew, it was her. Her office hadn't changed much. Warm lighting, stacks of files, the faint scent of something comforting, cinnamon maybe. When she saw me, her face lit up for a brief moment before concern replaced it. "Margaret," she said, "what happened?" "I need you to look at something," I replied, handing her the document. She didn't speak while reading, just studied it. Then she snorted. "That's not yours." I almost smiled. "You're sure?" "I'd bet my license on it," she said. "And this stamp? It's fake. Completely wrong format." There it was. Proof layered on proof. "They thought I wouldn't notice," I said quietly. "They thought people wouldn't listen," she corrected. That stayed with me. Because she was right. This wasn't just about deception. It was about assumption. They assumed I would be dismissed. They assumed I would be ignored. They assumed I would disappear. By the time I reached the county office, my body was starting to feel the strain. My legs ached, my back tightened, and I realized I hadn't eaten since the diner. But stopping didn't feel like an option anymore. Momentum matters. Once you start pushing back, you don't pause. You continue before doubt catches up. Inside, I gave my name. The clerk typed, paused, then frowned slightly. "There was a transfer filed," she said. "When?" "Yesterday." "Of course. Details?" I asked. She hesitated, then turned the screen slightly. "Joint ownership. My name. And Andrew's." I closed my eyes for a moment, not in defeat, just to steady myself. "Was I present?" I asked. She didn't answer directly, but she didn't need to. "Give me the forms," I said. She printed them without argument. That night, I returned to the shelter. Same cot, same quiet, but everything felt different, because now I knew. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't concern. This was a plan. And more importantly, it was a plan I could break. I lay there, staring at the ceiling again, but this time my thoughts were sharper, more focused. I wasn't thinking about what they had taken anymore. I was thinking about how to take it back. Step by step, document by document, truth by truth. They thought I would fade, but they forgot something important. I built my life once already, and I knew exactly how to build it again. By the third morning, the pain in my body had settled into something steady, almost familiar. My knees protested when I stood. My back reminded me of every mile I had walked the day before, but none of it slowed me down. Pain is a language the body uses to ask you to stop, but experience teaches you when not to listen. I had spent too many years pushing through discomfort to build a life just to abandon it now because things had become inconvenient. I sat on the edge of the cot in the shelter, my hands resting on my lap, studying them for a moment. They looked older than I remembered. Thinner, veins more visible, skin marked by time. But they were steady. That mattered. Steady hands can still sign documents, still point out truth, still build something back from nothing. I stood up, smoothed my clothes, and prepared for the next step. Lynette Rhea's office wasn't impressive at first glance, and that's exactly how I knew I was in the right place. People who rely on results rarely decorate their competence. The building was modest, brick, quiet, tucked between a dental office and a small insurance agency. Her name was printed in simple lettering on the glass door. No bold slogans, no promises, just presence. Inside, the air was cool and still. A young assistant greeted me, polite but not overly so, and handed me a form. I noticed immediately that he didn't hesitate when I told him I had no ID. He simply nodded, as if that was a problem meant to be solved, not a reason to dismiss me. That alone told me I had chosen well. When Lynette entered the room, she carried herself like someone who didn't waste time explaining her authority. Mid-50s, sharp eyes, posture straight enough to cut through doubt. She shook my hand firmly, not gently, not cautiously, firmly. "Margaret," she said, as if she already understood more than I had explained.
Seat.
"Start from the beginning." And I did. I told her everything. The motel, the missing documents, the bank, the forged signature, the house, the neighbor's confusion, the locks that no longer belonged to me. She didn't interrupt. Not once. She just listened, occasionally jotting something down, occasionally asking for a date, a name, a detail that mattered legally even if it felt small emotionally. By the time I finished, the room felt quieter, heavier, not with doubt, but with clarity. "This is elder financial abuse," she said finally, leaning back slightly. "And not subtle." There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty. They didn't just cross a line, they built a system around it. I nodded. Hearing it said out loud made it real, in a different way. Not just something that had happened to me, but something that could be proven. "What can we do?" I asked. She didn't pause. "We move fast. Emergency injunction to freeze any transactions tied to your name, especially the house. We challenge the power of attorney, file for fraud investigation, and start building a case strong enough that it doesn't collapse under pressure." Her words were precise, like tools laid out on a table. "Will it work?" I asked. She looked at me directly. "It already is. You caught it early. Most people don't." That stayed with me. Caught it early. Not lucky. Not unfortunate. Alert. Prepared. Present. She handed me a stack of papers. Affidavits, forms, timelines. Things that required signatures, statements, clarity. "You'll need somewhere safe to stay," she added. I hesitated for half a second. Pride is a strange thing. It rises at the worst times, tries to convince you that accepting help is the same as losing independence. But I knew better. Independence isn't refusing support, it's choosing the right kind. "I've been at a shelter," I said. She nodded once, then stepped out briefly. When she returned, her assistant was with her, holding a note. "We've arranged a temporary apartment through a partner program," he said. "Short term. Safe. No cost." I didn't argue. I simply nodded. Strategy over pride. That evening, I sat in a small apartment that didn't belong to me, but didn't reject me either. It was quiet in a different way than the shelter. Personal. Contained. There was a bed, a small table, a kitchenette, a bathroom with clean towels folded neatly. I turned on the faucet just to hear the sound of water under my control again. It's strange what you notice when things are taken away from you, how something as simple as running water can feel like a victory. I sat at the table with a notepad and began writing. Not memories, not emotions. Facts. Lists. What had been taken, what had been altered, what had been forged. House. Accounts. Documents. Identity. Then another list. What I still had. Knowledge.
Contact.
Awareness. Evidence. Myself. That last one I underlined twice. The next few days became structured in a way that left no room for hesitation. I returned to the county records office, this time not as someone asking questions, but as someone gathering proof. The clerk recognized me. She didn't say much, just printed what I needed and slid the papers across the counter. There was again the transfer, the signatures, the official language that tried to make something false look legitimate. But now I could see the cracks in it. The timing didn't align. The witnesses didn't match. The process had been rushed. Fraud often hides in speed. People assume if something moves quickly enough, no one will question it. They were wrong. I visited the moving company next. It didn't take long to find them. There are only so many options in one area. When I gave my name, the woman behind the counter hesitated at first, then softened when I explained. Your son said you were relocating, she admitted. That everything had been approved.
Of course he had.
Lies are easier when they sound reasonable. She printed the order anyway. His name was on everything. His signature, again clean, again deliberate.
Consistent.
Too consistent. Patterns matter. I took the papers and thanked her. The post office was next. Mail forwarding. Another quiet piece of the plan. Redirected without my knowledge, without my consent, without my presence. Each step they had taken was small on its own, but together they formed something larger. Something intentional. Not panic. Not desperation. Strategy. By the time I returned to the apartment that evening, exhaustion had settled deep into my bones. But so had something else. Certainty. I wasn't chasing a feeling anymore. I was building a case. Lynette reviewed everything the next day. She didn't smile often, but I saw something close to approval in the way she nodded as she flipped through the documents.
This is good, she said.
This shows intent. Not confusion. Not misunderstanding. Intent. That word mattered. In law, intent changes everything. It turns mistakes into actions. It turns accidents into decisions. It turns situations into cases. Will they fight? I asked. They'll try, she said. But people who build something like this rarely plan for resistance. They plan for silence. Silence. That's what they expected from me. That's what they built everything around. But silence was no longer an option. That night, I stood by the small window in the apartment, looking out at the street below. Cars passed, people walked. Life continued in that steady rhythm that doesn't stop for individual battles. And for the first time since the motel, I didn't feel displaced. I felt positioned. There's a difference. Displacement is when something is taken from you. Positioning is when you decide where you stand next. And I knew exactly where I stood. Not as a victim. Not as someone confused or forgotten. But as someone who remembered everything. They thought I was finished. They thought age would slow me, silence me, soften me into something manageable. They were wrong. Because I hadn't spent 74 years building a life just to watch it be rewritten by someone who thought I wouldn't notice. I noticed.
And now?
I was ready. By the time the hearing was scheduled, something inside me had shifted in a way I couldn't undo, even if I wanted to. The fear had burned off, not all at once, but gradually, like fog lifting from a road you didn't realize you were driving blind on. What remained wasn't anger either, not the kind that makes you reckless, but something colder, sharper, more precise. I had stopped reacting. I had started deciding. That difference changes everything. I spent the days leading up to the court date preparing in ways that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with control. I reviewed every document Lynette had organized, every statement I had signed, every piece of evidence that now existed not just in my memory, but in official records that couldn't be dismissed as confusion. I practiced speaking out loud, Not dramatically, not emotionally, just clearly. Facts don't need decoration. They need structure. The morning of the hearing, I dressed slowly. Not because I was unsure, but because I understood the weight of small choices. I chose a navy dress I had worn many times before. Not new, not impressive, but mine. I pinned my brooch at the collar, the one that had belonged to my mother. It wasn't about sentimentality. It was about continuity, about reminding myself that I came from something solid, something that couldn't be erased with a forged signature or a changed lock. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I didn't see someone displaced. I saw someone present, and that was enough. Lynette picked me up exactly on time. She didn't waste words on the drive, and neither did I. Silence between people who understand the situation doesn't feel empty. It feels efficient. When we arrived at the courthouse, I saw them immediately. Andrew and Kylie stood near the entrance, dressed like they were attending something important. Polished, controlled, presentable. It almost would have been convincing if I didn't know what sat beneath it. Andrew's posture was stiff, his shoulders slightly raised, like he was holding tension he didn't want anyone else to notice. Kylie stood close to him, but not touching. That told me more than anything else. Distance like that doesn't happen by accident. We didn't speak outside. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been written in documents and decisions. Inside the courtroom, the air felt too bright, too exposed. That's what courtrooms do. They remove shadows. There's nowhere to hide once everything is laid out in order. I sat beside Lynette, my hands resting calmly on the papers in front of me. I wasn't gripping them. I didn't need to. The truth was already steady. When the case was called, everything slowed down in a way that made each moment feel deliberate. The judge entered, composed, observant, the kind of presence that doesn't need to raise its voice to command attention. I watched her carefully. Years of experience teach you how to read people quickly. She wasn't interested in performance. That was good. Performance is where lies try to survive. Lynette stood first. Her voice was exactly what I expected, measured, controlled, and impossible to ignore. She didn't dramatize anything. She didn't need to. She presented the facts as they were. The forged power of attorney. The unauthorized access to accounts. The property transfer executed without my presence. The timeline that showed intention rather than confusion. Each piece of evidence moved from her hands to the clerks like something being built layer by layer, not a story but a structure. Something solid enough to stand on. I didn't look at Andrew while she spoke. I didn't need to. I could feel the shift in the room without turning my head. The subtle tension. The way silence settled heavier after certain words. Fraud. Forgery. Coercion. Words that don't bend easily once they're spoken in a courtroom. When it was their turn, their lawyer stood with a confidence that felt practiced rather than earned. He smiled slightly, the kind of smile meant to soften the edges of what he was about to say. "Your Honor," he began, "this is a family matter." That phrase alone told me exactly what direction he intended to take. Minimize. Reframe. Suggest misunderstanding. He spoke about concern, about age, about perceived confusion. He suggested that decisions had been made in my best interest, that perhaps I had agreed and later forgotten. Forgotten. That word landed differently than the others. I turned my head then. Not quickly. Not sharply. Just enough. Andrew didn't meet my eyes. That told me everything. The judge interrupted before the lawyer could build momentum. She held up one of the documents, her expression unchanged. "This signature," she said, "is under review." Her tone didn't rise, but it didn't need to. Authority doesn't announce itself loudly. It settles into the room and waits for people to adjust to it. Silence followed. Then she continued. This is not a matter of misunderstanding. This is a matter of validity. That was the moment everything shifted, not outwardly, but structurally. Because once a judge reframes the issue, everything that follows aligns with that framing. The arguments that came after felt smaller, less certain. The lawyer spoke again, but the confidence had thinned slightly. Lynette responded with precision, not force. That's what makes strength effective. It doesn't need to push when the foundation is already firm. When the judge finally spoke again, her decision was clear and immediate. A temporary injunction. All activity related to the property halted.
No transactions.
No access without court approval. The house frozen in place until the full hearing. I exhaled slowly. Not relief. Stability. Outside the courtroom, Andrew approached me. I could hear his steps before he spoke. "You didn't have to do this," he said. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it, something uneven. I turned to face him fully. "No," I said. "You didn't." That stopped him for a moment. Not because the words were loud, but because they were accurate. There's no defense against accuracy. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from years ago when he was younger, overwhelmed, unsure how to fix something he had already broken. "We can still handle this quietly," he said. Quietly. That word again. Always quietly. Always out of sight, out of record, out of consequence.
No. Irraplia.
"We can't." He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. Not confidence. Not control. Uncertainty. He hadn't expected resistance. That realization alone was enough to confirm everything. "I'll see you in court," I said. And I meant it. Back at the apartment, I sat down at the small table and let the day settle around me. The room felt different again, not because anything physical had changed, but because I had stepped into something that couldn't be undone. Once you take a stand publicly, there is no quiet return to what was. And I didn't want one. I didn't feel triumphant. That wasn't the point. I felt present, grounded, aligned with something that had been mine all along but had been tested in ways I hadn't expected. That night, I opened my notebook again. The same one I had started when everything first began to unravel. I added a new line under the others. They expected silence. They got a response. I read it twice. Then I closed the notebook. Because this wasn't the end. It wasn't even the turning point yet. But it was proof of something important. I had stepped back into my own life. And this time, I wasn't leaving it. After the first hearing, something changed in the way the world responded to me. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice at a glance, but in the subtle shifts that matter. People listened differently. Doors didn't open wider, but they opened without hesitation. My name, once something they thought they could rewrite quietly, had started to carry weight again, not because I demanded it, but because I proved it. And proof travels faster than explanation. I didn't rush into anything after that day. Momentum is important, but so is control. I spent 2 days in the apartment without leaving, not hiding, but preparing. I read every document again, every line, every date, every inconsistency. When you're building something that has to hold under pressure, you don't just stack evidence, you understand it. By the end of the second day, I didn't just know what had happened. I knew how it had been built, step by step, decision by decision. And that made it breakable. On the third morning, I went back to the bank. This time, I didn't feel like I was asking for access. I felt like I was reclaiming it. Eric met me near the entrance before I even reached the counter. "We've implemented the court order," he said, walking beside me. "All activity is frozen under review." I nodded. "Good," I replied. "Now I want to reset everything." He paused slightly, then understood immediately. We sat down in his office, and for the next hour, I rebuilt my financial identity piece by piece. New account protections, new access controls, every shared point of entry removed. It wasn't just about safety, it was about separation. There's a difference between protecting something and redefining it. I signed my name again and again, each time with intention, each time exactly the way it had always been written. Not the version they had tried to copy. The real one. Imperfect, slightly uneven, but mine. When I left the bank, the sun was lower than I expected. Time had passed without me noticing. That happens when you're focused. The city looked the same, but I didn't. That's the thing about change. It rarely shows up in the environment. It shows up in you. Back at the apartment, there was a letter waiting. No return address, just my name typed cleanly across the envelope. I opened it without hesitation. The handwriting inside was Andrew's. I recognized it instantly. It had changed over the years, become more controlled, more practiced, but there were still traces of the boy who used to write me notes from school.
We need to talk, it said. No epaleji. No explanation.
Just that. I placed it on the table and stared at it for a moment. There was a time when those words would have pulled me immediately into response, into concern, into the instinct to fix something before it broke further. But that time had passed. Talking had never been the problem. Truth had. The next day, I went to see Donna again. We worked on a formal statement for the court, something that would exist beyond conversation, beyond interpretation. She helped me shape my words into something precise, something that couldn't be dismissed as emotional reaction. You're not just telling a story, she said. You're establishing a record. That distinction mattered. Stories can be doubted. Records stand. We spent hours refining it, removing anything unnecessary, strengthening what remained. When it was done, I read it out loud once.
No hesitation. No checking.
Just clarity. Donna looked at me for a long moment, then nodded.
That will hold, she said.
I believed her. That afternoon, Lynette called. They've filed a response, she said. I leaned back slightly, already anticipating the direction. Let me guess, I replied. Confusion. Memory issues. Concern for my well-being. She gave a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh.
Exactly.
They've included statements from 2 doctors who've never treated you. I closed my eyes briefly. Predictable. Not original. Just desperate. Can they do that? I asked.
They can try, she said.
But they'll have to defend it. And we'll dismantle it. There was no uncertainty in her voice. I've scheduled an independent evaluation, she added. Reputable. Unbiased. That will carry weight.
Good, I said.
Because it was. That evening, something unexpected happened. There was a knock on the door. Not loud. Not urgent. Just steady. When I opened it, I found Emily and Ben standing there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. They looked older than I remembered, not just in years, but in expression. Confusion, hesitation, something unspoken sitting between them. Hi, Grandma, Emily said finally. I stepped aside.
Come in.
They entered carefully, like they weren't sure if they were crossing into something they were allowed to be part of. We sat down. I made tea because some habits don't change even when everything else does. They didn't speak right away. That's how you know something matters. Eventually, Ben looked at me.
We didn't know, he said.
I nodded. I know. Emily added, Dad told us you were moving, that it was your decision. I watched her closely. She wasn't defending him. She was trying to understand the space between what she had been told and what she was seeing now. And now? I asked. She hesitated. Now we're not sure what to believe. That was honest. And honesty is always a better place to start than certainty built on someone else's version of events. I'm not asking you to choose sides, I said. I'm asking you to pay attention. They both looked at me then, really looked. What happens now? Ben asked. Now I continue, I replied. With everything I've started. There was silence again, but it felt different this time. Not uncertain.
Processing.
When they left, Emily hugged me. Not quickly. Not politely. Fully. You don't deserve this, she said.
No. Irablia.
But that doesn't mean it stops. They walked away slowly, and I watched them go, not with sadness, but with awareness. Something had shifted there too. Not resolved, but opened. The next morning, I had the evaluation. Dr. Monroe's office was calm, structured, the kind of place designed to observe without interfering. She asked questions, detailed ones, precise ones. Dates, events, patterns, memory, reasoning. I answered everything without hesitation. Not because I had rehearsed, but because I knew. There's a difference between recalling something and understanding it. When the session ended, she studied me for a moment. You're very clear, she said. More than most. I nodded. I've had to be, I replied. She smiled slightly. That will be reflected in the report. And I knew it would. That night, I sat alone again, the apartment quiet around me. But it didn't feel temporary anymore. It felt like a place of transition, a place where something had been rebuilt, not physically, but structurally. I looked at the letter Andrew had sent, still on the table, still unanswered. I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to, because the conversation he wanted wasn't the one that mattered anymore. The truth was already moving, through documents, through statements, through people who were starting to see clearly. He thought he could control the narrative. But narratives don't survive evidence. And now, the truth wasn't hidden anymore. By the time the next hearing was scheduled, I no longer felt like someone trying to prove something. I felt like someone finishing what had already been established. There's a quiet difference between those two states. Proving requires energy, explanation, sometimes even defense. Finishing requires precision. Everything that needed to be uncovered had already surfaced. The forged documents, the timeline, the bank activity, the property transfer, the statements, the evaluation, each piece had moved from suspicion into record. Now, it wasn't about whether something had happened. It was about what would be done with it. And that distinction changes how you stand, how you speak, how you breathe when you walk into a room where your life is being examined. The days leading up to the hearing were not chaotic. That surprised me at first. I expected tension, anxiety, something restless under my skin, but instead, I found stillness. Not the empty kind, but the kind that comes when you've already made your decisions and there's nothing left to debate internally. I reviewed my statement one last time, not to memorize it, but to align with it. I didn't want to sound practiced. I wanted to sound accurate. There's a strength in speaking plainly that no performance can replicate. I stood in front of the mirror once, read it out loud, and stopped halfway through. Not because I forgot anything, but because I realized I didn't need to continue. I knew it. That was enough. On the morning of the hearing, the sky was gray with a steady, quiet rain. The kind that doesn't rush, doesn't storm, just persists. I took that as a fitting backdrop. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just consistent, like everything I had done to get here. I wore the same navy dress again, the same brooch, the same shoes. Consistency matters. It tells the story without needing words. Lynette picked me up, and again, we didn't fill the drive with unnecessary conversation. There's a trust that builds between people working toward the same outcome. You don't need to reassure each other. You just show up. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was different this time. Fewer people, but more focus. The kind of quiet that signals importance rather than routine. Andrew was already there. Alone. That was the first thing I noticed. Kylie sat several rows away, not beside him. That distance spoke louder than anything either of them had said so far. Separation doesn't happen without reason. It happens when alignment breaks. Andrew looked smaller than before, not physically, but in presence. The confidence he had carried into the first hearing had thinned, replaced by something tighter, more controlled. That's what happens when someone realizes the situation is no longer within their control. We didn't acknowledge each other, not because we couldn't, but because there was nothing left to exchange outside of what would happen in that room. When the judge entered, everything settled immediately. Her presence didn't need reinforcement. It carried its own authority. She reviewed the documents briefly, though I could tell she already knew them well. Judges don't arrive unprepared. They arrive decided in structure, if not in final conclusion. Lynette began, and this time, there was no need to build the foundation again. She referenced what had already been established, then introduced the additional evidence. The independent psychological evaluation. The inconsistencies in the opposing claims. The pattern of behavior shown through emails, transactions, and timing. Each point reinforced the same conclusion, not confusion, not misunderstanding, but intent. When my turn came, I stood, not quickly, not slowly, just deliberately. "My name is Margaret," I said. My voice didn't waver.
It didn't need to.
"I am not here because I am confused. I am here because I am clear." I paused, not for effect, but because the next words mattered more than the first. I was removed from my home under false pretenses. My financial access was taken using a document I did not sign. My identity was used without my consent, and I am here to state, clearly and without hesitation, that none of this was done with my permission. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Clarity carries its own volume. "I am not asking for sympathy," I continued. "I am asking for recognition of what has already been shown." I held the documents lightly in my hand, not as a shield, not as a weapon, but as proof. These records speak for themselves. I am here to make sure they are heard. I stopped there, because anything more would have been unnecessary. The room remained still, not tense, not reactive, just attentive. When Andrew's lawyer stood, the tone had changed. There was less confidence, more careful wording, more distance from earlier claims. He no longer leaned heavily on the argument of confusion. Instead, he spoke about pressure, about difficult circumstances, about intentions that may have been misguided but not malicious. It was a shift, a clear one. When someone changes their argument, it means the original one didn't hold. Andrew didn't speak.
He didn't look at me.
But I could feel the shift in him without needing to see his face. The judge asked a few questions.
Direct.
Specific. Focused on points that mattered. Authorization, presence, verification, consistency. Questions that don't allow space for vague answers. Answers were given, but they didn't build anything new. They simply confirmed what had already been established. When the judge spoke again, the room listened in a way that made everything else disappear. "This case," she said, "is not about family disagreement." Her voice was steady, controlled. "It is about legal authority and the misuse of it." She paused briefly, then continued. "The evidence presented shows clear discrepancies between the claims made and the actions taken. Those discrepancies are not minor." She didn't rush. Judges never rush when they're making something final. Based on the evidence, The court finds sufficient grounds to maintain the injunction and proceed with further action regarding the validity of the documents and the transfer of property. That was it. No dramatic conclusion. No raised voice. Just a decision that settled into place like something that had always been heading there. I exhaled slowly. Again, not relief. Resolution. Outside the courtroom, Andrew approached me once more. But this time, he didn't try to frame it as something small, something manageable, something that could be handled quietly. He looked at me directly, and for a moment, I saw something familiar. Not the man he had become, but the boy he had been. The one who used to come to me when he had made a mistake he couldn't fix on his own. I didn't think it would go this far, he said. And there it was. The truth, finally. Not justification. Not explanation. Just realization.
No, irraplia.
You didn't. He nodded slightly, as if that confirmed something for him more than it did for me. There was nothing else to say. Some conversations don't need continuation. They end exactly where they reveal what mattered. I turned and walked away. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just forward. Back at the apartment, I sat down at the table again. The same table where I had written my first list, where I had outlined everything that had been taken, everything that had been altered, everything that had been set in motion without me. I opened the notebook and added another line beneath the others. They expected me to accept it. I didn't. I looked at it for a moment, then closed the notebook. Because the line had already been drawn. Not in words, not in arguments, but in action. And once a line like that is drawn, it doesn't move. The day of the final ruling did not arrive with noise or tension. It arrived quietly, the way most decisive moments do, not with warning, but with certainty. By then, I no longer felt like I was waiting for something to happen. I felt like I was stepping into something that had already been built, piece by piece, decision by decision, until there was only one direction left for it to go. I woke early, not because I couldn't sleep, but because my body had returned to its old rhythm. The same rhythm I had lived with for decades. Responsibility doesn't leave you just because circumstances change. It reshapes itself. I stood in the kitchen of the small apartment, holding a cup of tea, watching the morning light settle across the table. It felt different now, not temporary, not uncertain. Just a place I had passed through on my way back to myself. I dressed with the same care as before. Not for appearance, not for anyone watching, but because I understood the importance of consistency. I wore the same navy dress again, the same brooch, the same shoes. There was something grounding about repetition. It reminded me that I hadn't changed in the ways that mattered. Only the situation had. Lynette met me outside, and this time, she gave a small nod before we even spoke. It wasn't encouragement. It was acknowledgement. We both knew where this was going. The courtroom was quieter than the previous hearings. No extra presence.
No curiosity.
Just the people who were directly involved in what was about to be decided. Andrew sat at his table, shoulders tense, his posture rigid in a way that suggested he was holding himself together rather than standing with confidence. Kylie was there too, but not beside him. She sat separately again, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed somewhere ahead that wasn't him. Distance had settled permanently between them, not just physically, but structurally. That's what happens when something built on agreement collapses under truth. When the judge entered, the room rose and settled again into stillness. There was no need for extended statements this time. Everything had already been said, documented, examined. This moment wasn't about argument. It was about conclusion. The judge began reading from her decision, her tone steady, measured, carrying the kind of clarity that comes from having reviewed every detail thoroughly. The court finds, she said, that the power of attorney presented in this case was not validly executed and does not reflect the voluntary consent of Mrs. Margaret. She paused briefly, allowing the weight of that to settle before continuing. Furthermore, the transfer of property conducted under that authority is determined to be improper and is hereby void. I didn't move, not because I wasn't affected, but because I had already arrived at that conclusion long before this moment. This was simply the official recognition of it. All rights, ownership, and control of the property are to be returned fully to Mrs. Margaret, effective immediately, she continued. Any financial activity conducted under the disputed authority will be subject to further review. There it was. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just final. I exhaled slowly, feeling something release. Not tension, not fear, but the last remaining uncertainty that had lingered beneath everything. The structure was complete now. There were no gaps left for doubt to settle into. The judge's final words were directed toward me. Mrs. Margaret, she said, this court recognizes not only the legal standing of your case, but the clarity with which you have presented it. Let the record reflect that. I nodded once, because that was enough. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, just open. Lynette walked beside me, holding the finalized documents. That's it, she said. I looked at her. That was necessary, I replied, because that's what it had been. Not a victory, not a triumph, a necessity. Andrew didn't approach me this time. He stayed where he was, and I didn't look back. Some endings don't require acknowledgement. They stand on their own. Later that afternoon, I stood in front of my house again, not as someone trying to get in, not as someone being denied, but as the owner. The locksmith was already there, waiting. He greeted me with a simple nod, no questions, no unnecessary conversation. He understood his role. Within the hour, every lock had been replaced, every point of entry reset. The house, once closed to me, now opened without resistance. I stepped inside slowly. The air felt unfamiliar at first, not because it had changed, but because it had been occupied without me. That leaves a trace. But beneath it, everything was still there. The structure, the layout, the quiet recognition of space that had held my life for decades. Some things were missing. Furniture rearranged, objects moved, pieces taken. But the foundation remained, and that was enough. I walked from room to room, not rushing, not searching, just observing. The kitchen, the living room, the hallway where the floor creaked in the same place it always had. My bedroom, stripped of its familiarity, but still holding the same light through the window. I paused in the center of the house and listened. This time, the silence didn't feel wrong. It felt settled. That evening, I sat in the living room on a chair they hadn't taken, holding a cup of tea. The house was quieter than I remembered, but not empty. Just waiting. Waiting to be filled again, not with what had been before, but with what remained after everything had been tested.
The phone rang.
I didn't expect it. I answered anyway. Grandma? Emily's voice. Yes, I said. It's over, isn't it? I looked around the room before answering. Not because I needed confirmation, but because I wanted to feel it fully. Yes, I said. It is. There was a pause on the other end. Can we come see you? She asked. You can, I replied. The next day, they arrived together. Emily and Ben. They walked up the path slowly, not with hesitation, but with awareness. They understood now that this wasn't just a house. It was something that had been fought for, that changes how people enter a space. Inside, we sat at the kitchen table. I made sandwiches. Simple.
Familiar.
We ate in quiet at first, then spoke in pieces. Not everything at once, just enough. Is Dad? Ben started. I don't know what will happen next, I said. But what needed to happen here is done. Emily nodded slowly. She looked around the kitchen, then at me. It feels like you, she said. I allowed myself a small smile. That's because it is. Later, they helped me unpack a box of photographs. We placed them back where they belonged, not exactly as before, but close enough. Continuity doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. When they left, the house felt fuller. Not because of what had been returned, but because of what had been reaffirmed. That night, I sat alone again, but not in the same way I had before. I wasn't rebuilding anymore. I was choosing what to keep, what to let go, what to carry forward. I opened my notebook for the last time and wrote one final line beneath everything else. I was not erased. I read it once, then closed the book and placed it on the table, because the story didn't need to continue there anymore. It had already moved into the life I was living, and this time, I was the one deciding what remained.